There is a word that scientists use for the very last individual of a species, the final one. The one that, when it dies, takes an entire lineage, millions of years of evolution, a unique way of being alive with it forever. The word is endling. And it is, I think, one of the loneliest words in any language. Because most extinctions in the history of this planet happened in the deep past, unseen and unrecorded. A species simply fading out of the fossil record with no witnesses. But a handful of extinctions happened recently enough that we were there. We saw the last one. We named it sometimes. We photographed it. We even, in one case, captured it on film. A living animal, pacing in its enclosure with no idea that it was the last of its kind, and that when it closed its eyes for the final time, its entire species would close with it. Today, I want to show you 4 of those final moments. The last confirmed sightings of 4 animals that no longer exist. Not as statistics, but as individuals, because each of them was a real creature that drew its last breath on a specific day in a specific place and left the world a little emptier when it went. These are the endlings. Let's begin with the one we can actually watch, the thylacine. If you've spent any time reading about extinction, you've almost certainly seen the footage. A strange, dog-shaped animal with dark stripes across its lower back and a stiff, thick tail, pacing back and forth in a bare concrete enclosure, occasionally opening its jaws in that astonishing, unnerving gape. A yawn so wide it seems to unhinge. That animal is a thylacine, the Tasmanian tiger. And it was neither a tiger nor a dog, but a marsupial, a pouched predator, the largest of its kind in modern times. And that grainy black and white film is one of the most haunting pieces of footage ever shot, because you are watching a species in its final days, and it doesn't know. The thylacine once roamed across Australia and New Guinea, but by the time Europeans arrived, it survived only in Tasmania. And there it was systematically destroyed, branded a sheep killer, hunted with government bounties paid for every dead animal, its habitat carved away. The numbers collapsed with terrifying speed, and it all funneled down to a single animal in the Beaumaris Zoo in Hobart. That animal is often called Benjamin, and it's the one in the famous film shot in the 1930s. On the 7th of September 1936, it was found dead in its enclosure, reportedly having been left exposed without shelter through a night of extreme weather. And with that, the thylacine was gone. But here, and this matters because getting these stories right is the whole point, I have to tell you that the truth is a little more complicated and a little sadder than the popular version. Because recent research by historians Robert Paddle and Catherine Medlock uncovered something remarkable in the zoo's old records. The famous filmed animal, the one everyone calls Benjamin, appears to have actually died earlier, in May of 1936. And shortly after, the zoo quietly acquired another thylacine, an old female caught by a local trapper. That transaction was kept off the books, likely because the trapping method was illegal at the time. And it was that animal, that unnamed old female, who was the true endling. She died on the 7th of September 1936. So the last thylacine was not the celebrated creature on film, but an anonymous old female whose name we will never know, who died in obscurity, unrecorded and uncelebrated in the same lonely zoo. The species was declared officially extinct decades later. And to this day, people still report seeing thylacines in the Tasmanian bush. None of it ever confirmed. But the footage remains, a last moving glimpse of an animal that we filmed and then let die. The passenger pigeon. Our second endling has a name, and it has become one of the most famous names in the entire story of extinction. Martha. And Martha's story is almost impossible to comprehend because of what her species had been. The passenger pigeon was, not long before, the most abundant bird in North America, and possibly the most abundant bird on Earth. We are not talking about large flocks. We are talking about flocks that contained billions of birds. Eyewitnesses in the 1800s described migrating flocks that stretched a mile wide and took hours, sometimes days, to pass overhead. So vast they darkened the sky and turned midday to twilight. Their numbers were estimated in the billions. This was one of the most staggering natural phenomena on the continent, and in the span of a few decades, we destroyed all of it. Through relentless commercial hunting, the birds were killed by the wagon load for cheap meat, and through the clearing of the forests they depended on, the most abundant bird in North America was driven with breathtaking speed to the very edge, and then over it. The great flocks thinned and broke apart and vanished until there was nothing left but a single bird in a cage. Her name was Martha, and she lived at the Cincinnati Zoo. Her two male companions had already died years before, and so for her final years, Martha was utterly, completely alone. The last passenger pigeon on Earth, a member of a species that had once numbered in the billions, sitting by herself in an enclosure, watched by curious visitors who came to see the very last one. On the 1st of September 1914, Martha was found dead on the floor of her cage. She was the endling, and the species that had once darkened the American sky was gone. There's a detail I find almost unbearably poignant. When Martha died, her body was packed in a 300-pound block of ice and shipped by train to the Smithsonian, where she was preserved. She is still there. You can go and see her. The last passenger pigeon, the final representative of the billions, reduced to a single, quiet specimen in a museum drawer. Her extinction is often credited with helping to awaken the modern conservation movement. We learned from Martha that abundance is no protection, that you can have billions and still lose every single one. The Pinta Island tortoise. Our third endling lived far longer and died far more recently enough that many of you will remember it. And he too had a name that captured his terrible situation perfectly. Lonesome George. George was a Pinta Island tortoise, a giant Galapagos tortoise from one specific island in that famous archipelago. And the Pinta tortoises had been devastated in the classic way. First by whalers and sailors in the 1800s, who took the giant tortoises by the thousands as a source of fresh meat that could survive for months in a ship's hold. And then by goats, introduced to the island, who stripped away the vegetation the tortoises needed to survive. By the early 20th century, the Pinta tortoise was assumed to be already extinct. And then, in 1971, a scientist studying snails on Pinta Island stumbled across something no one expected. A single, solitary giant tortoise, alive, roaming the ravaged island alone. It was a male, and he was, as far as anyone could ever determine, the last of his kind. He was given the name Lonesome George, and he was taken to a research station for his protection, where the search began for a mate, any mate that might let his lineage continue. It never happened. For 40 years, conservationists tried. They brought him females of the most closely related subspecies. George showed little interest, and the few eggs produced never hatched. He became a global icon, described by the Guinness Book of Records as the rarest creature in the world, a living symbol of the fragility of life, precisely because he was so utterly alone. And on the morning of the 24th of June 2012, his longtime keeper, Fausto Llerena, a man who had cared for him for 4 decades, found George dead in his corral. He was thought to be around 100 years old, which for a giant tortoise is not especially old. His death was, in a sense, unexpected. And with him, the Pinta Island tortoise passed from the world. A death witnessed, mourned, and documented in real time in our own century. The quagga. Our final endling is the oldest of the 4, and its story carries a special kind of tragedy, because it's a story of not realizing what you had until it was gone. The quagga was a subspecies of zebra from South Africa, and it was beautiful and strange, striped boldly across the head, neck and shoulders, but with the stripes fading away toward the middle of the body until its hindquarters were a plain, solid brown, like a horse. Half zebra, half horse in appearance. It roamed the grasslands of South Africa in great herds, and it was hunted relentlessly by European settlers for its hide and to eliminate it as a competitor for the grazing land they wanted for their livestock. And here is the peculiar tragedy of the quagga. It went extinct partly because nobody quite realized it was a distinct animal worth saving. The name quagga was often used loosely for any zebra, so as the true quaggas vanished from the wild, few understood that a unique creature was slipping away entirely. By the time anyone grasped that the wild quaggas were gone, there were only a handful left, scattered in European zoos, and no coordinated effort to save them. The very last known quagga, a lone mare, died at the Artis Magistra Zoo in Amsterdam on the 12th of August 1883. And it's believed that nobody at the time even realized she was the last. Her death passed unremarked. Only later did the world understand that when that mare died in Amsterdam, an entire animal had ended. The quagga lived early enough that we have no film of it, and only a handful of photographs. A few precious images of a single mare in a London zoo, the only quagga ever photographed alive. Those grainy pictures are all the moving world will ever see of it. So there they are, 4 endlings. A striped marsupial filmed pacing in its cage, a lone pigeon, the last of billions, a solitary tortoise found dead by the man who loved him, and a half-striped mare who died before anyone understood what was being lost. And I want to leave you with the thread that binds all 4 together, because it's the thing that makes these stories matter rather than merely sadden. Every one of these extinctions was caused by us. Not by an asteroid, not by a volcano, not by the slow indifference of geological time, but by human hands. By hunting, by habitat destruction, by carelessness, by the failure to understand what we had until it was already gone. These were not inevitable. Each of these animals could have been saved. We simply didn't. But there's a reason to tell these stories beyond mourning, because we remember them now. We have the film of the thylacine, the specimen of Martha, the memory of George, the photographs of the quagga. And in remembering, we learn something. Martha's death helped birth the conservation movement. George became a global symbol that changed how people think about vanishing species. Their endings were not entirely in vain, because they taught the living to pay attention. The endling is the loneliest word in the language, but it doesn't have to be the last word, because every one of these final sightings is also a warning and a plea from an animal that is no longer here, asking us to make sure the list doesn't grow any longer. Whether we listen is up to us. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep looking up and take care of what's still here.